So far, we've looked at the problems that we had with Great Britain that led to the Revolution. And then we looked at our first Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. But that didn't work. So we threw out the Articles of Confederation and wrote a new Constitution. And let's look at some of the basics of the new Constitution. The Constitution was written in the summer of 1787, and it went into effect a couple of years later after the states ratified it. The purpose of the Constitution is to set out the ideals that the people believe in, to also establish a basic structure of our government. What can the government do? How do we elect leaders? What kind of powers do they have? How long do those leaders are in office? Those should all be answered in the Constitution. And it should provide for the supreme law of the land. The Constitution is the most important laws that we have in this country. No law can conflict with the Constitution. The Constitution always wins. We'll talk about that later, too. The preamble of the Constitution is kind of like the introduction, but it really establishes what we hope to accomplish with the Constitution. So it starts out, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, and so on. You can read this. But what do each of these things mean? Well, to form a more perfect union would be a better country. To establish justice. Justice is laws that treat people fairly, to ways to ensure that wrongdoings don't go unpunished, but people are punished correctly and equally, and that's justice. To ensure domestic tranquility means peace within the country, so you can go about your daily life without insurrection and riots and whatever, just to ensure that we have a peaceful nation. That's domestic tranquility. Provide for the common defense means that we are safe from foreign invasions, that the government's job is to protect us from foreign countries. To promote the general welfare. That's just let people thrive, I guess, would be general welfare. Create a road system so that people can drive or take their goods to market. Just provide the basic general structure of the country. Secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. These blessings of freedom, of liberty, we need to make sure that they are secure, not just for us, but also for those who come after us. So that's the goal. The preamble really states these are the goals. This is what we're going to try to accomplish with this Constitution. Some of the stuff in your note, guys, it takes you to parts of the Constitution that you need to get that information, and you can get that on your own. Let's go over some basic stuff. Most of you know what a democracy is. It's a type of government that is ruled by the people, but there really are two types of democracies, a direct democracy and a representative democracy. We have a representative democracy, which is sometimes referred to as a republic. And what a representative democracy is we elect people who then represent us. So we don't vote on every bill in Congress. Instead, we elected a representative and two senators from South Dakota who cast their votes and make the laws themselves. That's a representative democracy. That's really the practical form of democracy. And that's what we have. Sometimes it's referred to as a republic. They mean the same thing. There are some basic principles to the Constitution that are really, really, really important. And I want to introduce you to them in this unit, but we keep coming back to them all year long. Because they're that important. And, really these are the ones that you will need to have a good grasp on, as the year goes on. One of them is the separation of powers. We were concerned of government having power. That's why, remember, in the Articles of Confederation, we didn't give government very much power. Well, that didn't work out. So we realized, we have to give government power. But we were still afraid of government. How do we give government power without them abusing that power? Well, one thing that we did was we divided power up among three branches. So there are three branches of government: the legislative branch, which is Congress, the lawmaking body; the executive branch, which is the president and other executive officials; and the judicial branch, which is the courts. And rather than saying government has the power to tax, we divided power up and gave tax power to, in this case, Congress. So Congress has the power to tax. Okay, so the president can't raise or lower your taxes. The Supreme Court can't raise or lower your taxes. Only Congress can. Same thing, we gave Congress most of the powers. The president has some. The Supreme Court and the judicial branch has some. But we didn't want to combine all powers into one individual. We figured by separating the powers between three branches that they all play a role, but they don't have unlimited power to do whatever they want. This is important, and as we study the branches of government, the powers they have become, makes it more understandable. But along with that, along with the separation of powers, we also have a system of checks and balances, which is a second key thing. And checks and balances is not only did we separate power, but the powers we gave to one branch can be used to check a power that's used by another branch or to balance out their power. And I have an example on here of Congress is a lawmaking body. So Congress writes laws, but those laws don't go into effect if the president doesn't like them. So the president doesn't get to write laws, but the president can veto laws if he does not approve those. And even though Congress can override that veto, it's difficult to do so. So veto power is a power that only the president has that he can use to limit or check a power lawmaking that Congress has. And there's lots of examples of these. I'll give you another. The president appoints federal judges. So let's say a Supreme Court justice passes away and the president appoints a new judge. Okay, that's the president's power. Only he or she can do that. However, that judge does not take office if the Senate rejects him. And the Senate is part of the legislative branch. So the legislative branch, or the Senate in this case, has what we call confirmation power. So if the president appoints someone to be a judge, but the Senate doesn't confirm them, that judge doesn't take office. That person the president appointed doesn't get to be that judge. He would have to choose somebody else. So even though the president has the power to appoint judges, that power is limited or checked by a power given to another branch of government. And that's pretty important. It's also something we'll come back to over and over this year. Federalism is another key concept that really the United States came up with. Remember the colonies, they had a lot of self-rule. When the colonies, after the Revolution, they became states, but under the Articles of Confederation, basically the states they could do almost everything. The federal government couldn't do much at all. Well, that didn't work. When we wrote this Constitution, we didn't throw out this idea of states because it was entrenched in us. Those colonies, now states, had been around too long. They had a lot of self-rule. So we still kept that. And what federalism is sharing power between the state governments. So each state, you understand the states, has their own government. And they share power with the federal government. And the federal government is the national government, Washington, D.C. So South Dakota has our own state legislature. We have our own governor, which is an executive. We have our own state Supreme Court and our own court system. And so does the federal government. And every state has their own set of laws, their own, government themselves, and they make the rules for their own state. Each state has their own constitution. Now, the federal government also makes laws. So really, in the United States, there's 51 sets of laws. Each state has one, so there's 50 sets of laws, plus the federal government has a set of law. And some laws are state laws and some are federal. Actually, most laws are state laws. I like to use this example. When you're thinking of federalism, think of our school and think of each classroom as being a state. Now, in that state, in my classroom, I make most of the rules. I decide, if you have to be sitting when the bell rings, or, to be on time, or if you have to be inside the door. I decide, when I'm going to give homework and when I'm going to give tests and what kind of homework I'm going to give. And most of the rules that I make within my classroom are made by me. However, so think of those as being state laws. And each teacher in their own classroom has similar ones, but they can make them however they want. Okay, that's giving the states the power to do stuff. However, there are some laws that we'll say that the school board makes, and those have to apply equally across all of the classes. So one of those rules is that you can't eat in class. I can't make that rule. I can't change that rule. That's been made by higher ups. We'll say, the school board we'll say the school board. And those laws apply to everybody. Think of that as being a federal law. Federal law applies to all the states equally. The states have to follow it. But most of the rules are made by the states themselves, most of the laws. That's federalism. The states have the power to make laws. The federal government has the power to make laws. Federalism is established really through two parts. One, Article 4, Section 4 says, the United States shall guarantee every state in the Union a republican form of government. So every state has the constitutional right to have their own representative form of government, and every state does. And the 10th Amendment says, powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are then reserved for the states respectively, meaning that if the federal government doesn't have the power to do something, then the state has that power. Okay, so a good example is driver's license. The federal government doesn't give out driver's license. There's nowhere in the Constitution that says they have the power to give out driver's license. So then that is a power that is reserved for the states. And we'll get into the powers more in a bit in the next section. There are some things the states cannot do, and these are powers that are denied to the states. So the states cannot have their own army or navy. They can't enter a war. They can't enter treaties. They can't coin money, those type of things. Okay, the next thing we're going to look, I guess one last thing here, and that is the Supremacy Clause. The Supremacy Clause found in the Constitution, Article 6, Section 4 says, the Constitution and the laws of the land, laws of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land, which means that even though the states have the power to do things, if the federal government has the power to do something and the states have the power to do something, and those two laws conflict, the federal government wins. It also means that the Constitution wins over anything else, that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. So the Constitution says we have free speech. If the federal government would pass a law that takes away free speech, it would conflict with the Constitution, and the Constitution is supreme. So the Constitution's right, giving us the right of free speech, overrides that federal law. The same thing goes with states. If the state has the power to make a law and so does the federal government's law wins out over the state. Minimum wage is a good example of that. The states can set a minimum wage, the federal government can set a minimum wage. But if the state's minimum wage is less than the federal government's minimum wage, the federal government's minimum wage wins. So if the federal minimum wage, if they pass a law and make the federal minimum wage $9 an hour, and the state of South Dakota says, well, it's $8.50 in our state, we have to go to $9 because of the Supremacy Clause. The federal government wins out. But the the Constitution is always the highest. Okay, that's a little bit of the background on this. The next thing we'll look at is the specific powers.